So welcome, everybody. I'm going to put the prayer up on the screen. I've got everyone muted to minimize the background noise, but feel free after the prayer to unmute yourself if you're on Zoom and would like to be part of the conversation. Okay, so let's say our prayer together. Glory be to the Father, who by his almighty power and love created me in his image and likeness. Glory be to the Son, who in his incarnation became man, so that I could become God. Glory be to the Holy Spirit, who divinizes me in the Son and makes me a partaker of his divine nature. Glory be to the holy and undivided Trinity, now and forever. Amen. Just gonna again do the mute here, and please unmute to share or ask a question. So as we kind of gather today on Wednesday, it's February 23rd, 2022. You know, we hope these will be watched 100 years from now, so they'll know that we were 100 years ahead of the curve. No, what we want to do in the Wednesday gathering and in the house of prayer, if it ever pleases God to let me reside in such a place, just invite the disciples of the future, the intentional disciples, those who have survived the great consolidation in St. Louis and elsewhere in the Catholic Church. I think everybody kind of knows the church is, in most places, shrinking in numbers, overall shrinking in numbers. It's always interesting to me. I can't tell you how many videos I watch in different contexts, whether it's a near-death experience or contemplative prayer or spirituality venues on the internet. Hardly a day goes by that some of the key powerful witnesses on those and in other groups, other Zoom gatherings that I'm part of, I don't think I've ever turned on the internet and looked at one of those kind of videos or interactive forums that I haven't heard a person say, I used to be a Catholic, or I was raised a Catholic, or I'm a recovering Catholic. And a lot of people say that with a certain glee in their voice that is greatly, it really saddens me. I was on one Zoom meeting the other day for kind of it's a spiritual sharing group, and one of the ladies said how she thought her religious upbringing, she kind of feels free now of her religious upbringing, which induced a lot of guilt in her. So you know, those are people's personal experiences, and you can't raise a question one way or the other about that. Sometimes on the interactive things that I'm a part of, people don't always know I'm a Catholic priest, and I wished I had the opportunity sometime to tell them that if you understood the heart of the tradition, you would feel a lot better about your Catholic upbringing, perhaps, than you do now, or maybe you'd have a different appreciation of it. But the fact of the matter is that the mystical depths of Christianity, as experienced by the first Christians and still kept alive pretty much in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic Church. Ukraine, for example, which is much in the news today, they have a very profound Catholic, Orthodox, patristic, meaning early church, appreciation of what the Christian faith is. Pope John Paul II, who was obviously raised in Poland, but Poland's right on the cusp between East and West. And so even though the Polish form of Christianity is very Latinized and very Roman in its form, it has the heart of the East still in it. It's a very deep, it goes beyond words. Real Christianity goes beyond words. I compared it earlier, the tradition of Christianity, what's alive in Christianity, the presence of the living Christ in Christianity could be compared to the current in a river. You can't stand in the same river twice, and you can't capture the current. All you can do is allow yourself to be carried along with the current And it's interesting there that maybe this is a good analogy. I haven't really played it out like this, but it's occurring to me now. When you're carried along by the current is not, you can't find the current in the water. If you took a bucket of water out of the river and put it under a microscope and said, where's the current? You wouldn't find it. So that's a very good example of the way in which God, the river of God's love and the river of God's presence, goes through the world. You can put any portion of the world under a microscope and go down as far to the subatomic level as is possible to do, or go to the furthest reaches cosmologically of what's possible to do, and you still will not find God. And yet, everything that is microcosmically and macrocosmically, everything that is because of the presence of the current within it. And now I change the metaphor of current to think of kind of an electrical current. And I'm not an electrician. I know we have some scientists among us here, but I think that it doesn't current pass through copper? Does it go through copper? So if you were to watch the copper, you'd see the molecules vibrating, but the electricity, you could never put your finger on it. But if you put your finger on it, you would know it was there. That's a good way of saying. Okay, so God, a current in a river or a current in electricity, is really real, but it's not going to be found in any of the particles through which it makes its presence manifest. So the world manifests the presence of God, but the world does not, you cannot find God outside the world or within the world. And yet the world is because of the current that's flowing through, which is the life of God. But that life of God is uncapturable, it's unnameable, it's unthinkable, really, uncategorizable. You're not able to dogmatize about it. You can say a lot of things about its effects, but you can't. What it is in itself remains not only unknown, but inherently unknowable. Okay, but it can be known by its manifestation. Now, what we as Christians believe is that the current that constitutes the being of the world has in fact appeared to us in the flesh. And that's also an unnameable mystery, unable to be articulated, unable to be described, unable to be defined, but able to be believed. That somehow the source of that which is has made itself visible in one of the objects that are, namely the Son of Mary. But we also believe as Christians that the Son of Mary, though manifesting the eternal word or presence of God, does not constrict God and does not I hesitate to use the word contain, because the fullness of God abided in the person of Jesus of Nazareth and the Son of Mary. But it was not exhausted. The eternal word, the identity of the person that Jesus is not exhausted by his physical incarnation. And we know that his body, like all of our bodies, also dissolved. Now, his apparently dissolved in a way that we also cannot comprehend. But he was never identical with his body. Rather, he took a human body to himself to make visible for a very brief period of time the mystery of the presence of God. And I talk about it as the presence of God because everything we Christians say about God is inherently Trinitarian. So in the desert, for example, when the Israelites were wandering around, the cloud came down out of the sky. Okay, the cloud represented the presence of God. But even when the cloud descended upon the ark and upon the tent, it's a long way from infant baptism, isn't it? But we're getting there. Also, parenthetically, in the news this week was the kerfluffle out in Arizona and apparently in other places as well. And I'm sure many more will come to light, kind of like the sex abuse scandal of the priest. Once one comes out, there'll be a million coming out. And the current scandal, so to say, I consider it a tempest in the teapot, and I'll tell you why. in half an hour or so. And that is that it was discovered somehow, some way, that one of the priests in the Diocese of Phoenix was baptizing children. We baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And the correct formula is, I baptize you. So somebody raised the issue, aren't all those baptisms invalid, and therefore don't all the other sacraments, including marriage, also, aren't they invalid? And this goes back generations. So what do we do about all those people? Pretty soon we'll be like the Mormons, baptizing dead people to make sure they get into the kingdom of heaven. But I'll address that issue, but I want to create the larger context, because none of these kerfluffles in canon law or morality or rubrics about the liturgy, none of the things that Catholics worry about. Was my confession sincere? Did I remember everything? What if I didn't remember everything? Does it count? If I come before, Father, I came a minute and 30 seconds after the offertory began. Does Sunday Mass count? All these kinds of questions, the very questions themselves show you that we are living in an age that has completely forgotten and lost complete touch with the mystery of the Christian faith. Okay, once the mystery is entered into, all these other details become relatively irrelevant. And even the moribund, even the rigidified Roman Catholic Church that we are in now and that we have inherited for the last, as Pope Benedict said, for the last 1100 years or so, even in this church, we still have sayings available to us that do relativize, that is to say, render relatively unimportant all those things that most Catholics worry about. Okay, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute as well. In other words, there still exists within the Catholic Church certain mechanisms of grace and what we would call in the secular world, will kind of grandfather them into the kingdom. Even though they were invalidly baptized, we think God is generous enough, he's going to grandfather them in, kind of like when you're being laid off from your job. Yeah, you're going to lose your seniority, but we're going to grandfather you in. There's a grandfathering in the Catholic Church. There's a version both in the Eastern Church and in the Western Church. I guess I am addressing this a little bit now, but when the whole kerfluffle started, all the archbishop had to say to avoid the whole problem and put everybody's mind at rest, except those arch-conservative, anal retentive Catholics who are suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, who want to make sure that their T's are crossed and their I's are dotted and their ducks are in a perfect row, they're still going to get their shorts in a knot no matter what the bishop tells them, okay? But a bishop who understood the larger vision of God's mercy as communicated in the mystery of the Catholic Church could have used two words that are right at the heart and center of canon law. In the Christian East, when somebody has a problem like that, I don't know if I kept the Lenten fast. See, in the Christian East, they call it the Great Fast. So they really fast there. They abstain from meat on Mondays and Wednesdays. These are Eastern Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics. They abstain from meat on Wednesdays and Fridays and only have one meal a day on Wednesdays and Fridays. They fast without any bread and water on Good Friday. And some people fast on bread and water for the whole. They don't take any dairy products during Lent. They don't drink any olive oil or any oil that gives unction to food during Lent. I mean, they do the real thing, okay? So you can imagine an Eastern Catholic beset by scrupulosity, which is not a religious affliction, it's a psychological illness, obsessive compulsive disorder, but it issues religiously, it issues in scrupulosity. People are worried, they oh God, I didn't keep we used to have I don't want to say Rogaine, that's a hair treatment. What were the kind of, we had some kind of, well, we had all kinds of special fast days, could never keep them. I remember when I first ran in, and thank God, God delivered me from scrupulosity at this point. I was a fifth grade altar server at St. John's Catholic Grade School, and we were going down, it was First Friday, we'd gone to confession, all 800 of us, oh God, think of the poor priests in that parish. All 800 of us had gone to confession on the Thursday before Good Friday, or First Friday, because they wanted everybody to go to communion on First Friday. And we went to Mass every day at 8 o'clock. and I was a server, and I happened to be serving on this first Friday. I was in 5th grade, and I came down. I was still sleepy. My mother's trying to get me off to school. I sit down at the kitchen table. I got my cornflakes. I take a spoonful. Oh God, it's first Friday. Now, in those days, you had to fast from midnight till Mass, till communion. I spit out the cornflakes. I said, Mom, it's first Friday. Now you would think that first Friday, it's supposed to be a feast of divine mercy, Sacred Heart, devotion to Sacred Heart. You can see how these traditions become ossified so quickly. It didn't become a feast of joy. It became a feast of terror. What if I'm going to be, oh my God, those kids in 5th grade are going to, when I don't receive communion, are going to all be, listen, what do you do? Commit adultery? Even though I didn't know what adultery was at that time. I said, they're going to think I committed adultery. I said to my mom, she said, don't worry, it'll be all right. See, I always looked at my mother as the best image of what God was like. Because when I had problems with church, I always turned to my mother and she grandfathered me in. That's how I was. So I said, what am I going to do? Oh God, I'm up there on the altar. Everybody's going to see that I say no to Father Finucane. She says, well, I'll call Father Finucane and we'll see what he says. Now, this poor guy, good guy. He was a model parish priest. I loved him and I looked up to him. And I actually met him towards the end of his life after I had been ordained, and actually I had left the priesthood by that time. But by that time, I was also trying to come back to the priesthood. So I saw him, and I was preaching a homily, even as a so-called lay person for my baseball coach in college. And Father Finucane in his 80s was there. I have to tell you another story about Father Finucane as well. But he was at this funeral, and he came up to me and he said, he says, I sure hope you make it back to the priesthood. He says, that was one of the best homilies I ever heard. I said, well, thank you. I said, I love Mr. Sieturski, who was my baseball coach. But in those days, now Father Finucane had been liberated from his straitjacket Catholicism. But when my mother called him on that first Friday to say, my son Phil has eaten a spoonful of cornflakes, he spit it out, Father, to his credit. He spit it out. But he did, I mean, yeah, it's a droplet. There are membranes, there are permeable membranes in that mouth of it. Well, Father Finucane in those days, who, was formed in that, 18 inches apart, holding your hands at Mass, and anything more was a mortal sin. I mean, that's why Martin Luther, by the way, just incidentally, that's why Martin Luther left the Catholic Church. There were so many rubrics. You know what a rubric is? Rubric is a directive for how the priest's supposed to behave. He's supposed to lower his eyes at certain points. He's supposed to only raise the host this far, not that far, this far. You're supposed to hold your hands so many inches apart. In the old days, when I was going to school, and Father Finucane was there taking my mother's question at the rectory, because this is the context for his answer. If you stepped outside the bounds of those rubrics, you were committing a sacrilege. You were violating the sacredness of the Mass, which in those days was and this shows you how rigidified and ossified and sclerotic the church had become. And this was going on for hundreds of years before, well, all goes all the way back past Luther, but Luther was right in the heart of it. And he said, Luther used to have to start the Mass over time and time again because he would mispronounce a word, and he was a Latin scholar. So he said, oh God, I pronounced it hic est corpus meum instead of hoc est. I've got to start all up. So after a while, he just couldn't function. Like anybody who's got obsessive compulsive disorder, he was either going to kill himself or have a heart attack, or something else had to happen. And he claims, does Luther, that it happened when he was on the toilet. Some of the greatest revelations happen in the bathroom. And Luther, he was literally reborn. The chains of his scrupulosity. Now, it was really, for Luther, it was a psychological awakening, really. It was a breakthrough. He had a breakdown and a breakthrough at the same time. He was literally losing his mind. He was a very erudite scholar, knew Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and several other languages, translated the New Testament after he had his awakening. And his awakening was he was on the toilet reading the letter to the Romans. He was reading the New Testament, trying to find a way out of his prison, his scrupulous prison. And he came across verse 1 of chapter 5 of the Romans. The righteous man, and Luther knew enough Greek and Latin to know that righteous doesn't mean morally righteous, because that's what he was being told. You have to live under the law of the church, which is a moral code and a rubrical code, liturgical code. And if you don't, you'll go into hell. And he opened this book, he knew that Christ was somehow more present in the scriptures than in the catechism. He knew that. Catechism is an after the fact commentary on something that is more primordial, something that's more fundamental. And Luther read 5:1 in Romans, the righteous man, the just man, the man who's in right relationship with God, the person who's properly aligned with God, lives by faith, not by works. And I'm telling you, it was like a ton of bricks fell from his shoulders. And he said, why hasn't anybody else seen this? And then he ran with that in a direction that took him a little bit far afield, but you can't blame the guy, really. He had no other alternative in a way. Anyway, I don't want to get back into the history of Luther though it was a psychological breakthrough for him, it was also a spiritual revelation to him that God is not as scrupulous as I am. There's something more fundamental. And then he started reading further in Paul, where Paul says, it's our father Abraham. Abraham believed in the promises of God and thereby was considered in right relationship with God. It was because of his faith, that trust, surrender to God. It was because of his trust in God and in God's promises that made Abraham righteous in God's sight. So that was Luther's story. So Father Finucane, though, had not yet had his Martin Luther moment. Now, he did have his Martin Luther moment later, and I'm going to tell you about that. And I will get around to the topic of today's discussion. It's funny how God takes these things. Huh? So Father Finucane said to my mother, Mrs. Krill, I wasn't privy to the conversation, so I'm paraphrasing. I'm putting pieces together here as I know Father Finucane and what he became and what he was then. There were 4 priests in my parish. He was just a lowly associate. He had his assigned seat at the dinner table. And the pastor would have the little bell and he would ring it and nobody would start. I mean, there were rules at the dinner table too in those days. Everything in the Catholic Church was legislated by canon law, by liturgical law, by rubrics, by moral codes, by the laws of the church. There were so many laws it was like walking through a minefield. That's why most priests left the church when the lid came off. They said the whole thing is founded on a mistake. The whole thing is founded on a few psychologically deranged people who are trying to impose their anxiety on the whole Catholic world. I mean, that's how people looked at it. And that's what accounts for so many people just flying the coop. It wasn't they had lost faith in God. Many of those people went on to found houses of prayer, some came back to the priesthood like me. Others, though, have done great things spiritually for people, but they are the ones who say, I'm a recovering Catholic. What they're not really recovering from Catholicism. They were never taught Catholicism. They were never taught the heart of the tradition. They never felt the current. They never were carried away by the current. They were electrocuted when they put their hand close to the current. So they assumed that God is a terrible thing, like to be feared, like the mountain of Moses, when they came close, touched it, and were killed. Okay, so Father Finucane, so let's assume anyway, the bottom line was your kid can't go to communion. He broke the rules. I was crying. I mean, it's amazing. I didn't leave the church in 5th grade, but everything, you left the church, you were not saved. And same thing, not baptized in the proper form. you are screwed. Okay, so should have finished my cornflakes. Darn right. Wish I had it to do over. I should have. Maybe I did finish the cornflakes because I did become addicted to food after a while. Let me tie the loop on. Oh God, I can tell you stories about altar boys. One of the great benefits of being an altar boy was that after everybody else went to mass at 8 o'clock, if you were serving, they would all have to go to school. But because you served, you could take your breakfast, you could carry your breakfast and go down into the cafeteria. And there were always 4 altar boys serving at the 8 o'clock mass. Can you imagine that? And there were 4 altar boys serving at the 6:30 mass. There were 8 altar boys every day at St. John's. And that wasn't often enough. There were too many more guys wanted to serve than had the opportunity. That's how it was in those days, because everything was invested in following that form. But after mass, the 4 altar boys who served the 8 o'clock mass, they didn't have to go to class right away. They could go down to the cafeteria and have hot chocolate and whatever breakfast they brought. And I would always want to serve with Michael Shementi because his mother made the best toast. And he would come with this toast that I just loved. And I would always stop at the Day Old Donut store on the way to school. My dad would drop me off. It was about a block from school. I'd walk in, they had 4 Day Old donuts for 10 cents. So I'd give him a dime. I get the 4 Day Old donuts and I could trade 3 donuts for Michael Shementi's toast. And I would keep 1 donut for myself. That's probably why I fell asleep in class. You know, we go up. No, I mean, though, you know, I could, you know, those were and many of us grew up with that kind of Catholicism. Okay, now where was the golden thread here? What were we trying to get back to? Let me tie the loop on Father Finucane as well. So he had a crisis of faith, as did many who were shaped in that neo-scholastic manualist tradition. Do you know what the manualist tradition is? Because people couldn't read St. Thomas Aquinas and understand him on their own. And because they didn't have anybody who understood the mystical depths of Thomas Aquinas and the people who preceded him, because there was nobody by that time in the church who really, if you talked about mysticism in those days, or you talked about contemplative prayer, they would say, oh, that's for the Carmelites. That's for John of the Cross people. We don't know about that stuff. We just know about the sacraments. Get the sacraments, do it in the proper order, follow the right form, and you'll be good with God. That's all you need to know. You don't worry about that. The devil can work. If you're trying to be a mystic, the devil, all this stuff. So the depths of spirituality, it wouldn't have been possible for a person like Richard Rohr or Thomas Merton to exist in those days. And Thomas Merton was one of the first ones who opened up the larger Catholic world to the fact that contemplative prayer is not the inheritance just of monks. It's of everybody is called to perfect union with God. And this was like a new idea. You weren't called, that was nuns and priests. See, so there was a hierarchy of favor in God's church. You know, priests first, nuns second, monks maybe third. I don't know what, you know, and then lay people way down here. Your job is to do and die, not to question why. And fathers is to give you orders. And that's how it was. And so you can see that it was based on a medieval military model of authority. And so our picture of God then mirrored that military model of authority, and our manual for getting into heaven also modeled what was basically a political model of relationship with God. And it was done without malice. It was done just, see, I told you in many of these gatherings, and Protestants say this is where the church went off the rails, and it was brought back on the rails when Martin Luther had his awakening. This is the Protestant version of history. Went off the rails when Constantine turned the church from a community without buildings, like Bishop Rozansky's trying to get us to, or get fewer buildings. We weren't prisoners of buildings. We were a minority, almost unknown. The only reason the emperor cared about Christians was that they were proclaiming that there was a rival to his authority out there, somewhere somebody they called the Lord and God, and they wouldn't worship to the gods of Rome, and therefore they were seditionists, they were treasonists. So they were being tried, as St. Polycarp, our martyr for today and today's Mass, St. Polycarp, disciple of St. John, was burned at the stake by Diocletian because he refused to acknowledge the Roman gods as God. He worshiped Jesus as Lord. And it's really interesting. I want to tie this in a little bit to last week's gospel where it says, love your enemies and forgive those who persecute you. You heard about the story, and this is a true story. You can look it up on NPR, and there are many stories like it, but there was a guy in Washington, D.C. in 1980, I want to say 88, something like that. He came to a very exclusive dinner party because he knew there'd be a lot of jewelry there that he could rob. So he came in with his gun, stuck up the dinner party, and the lady whose house this was in, she was such a self-possessed person. She looked at the guy and she says, I suppose you want all our jewelry. He says, that's right. Give it to me now or there'll be harmful consequences. The lady says, do us a favor. Have dinner with us first, then we'll give you our jewelry. But get a seat for this guy. He's looking at her, huh? She says, you want a glass of wine? He says, yeah, I wouldn't mind. Well, by the end of the evening, they do give him their jewelry. They say, we're pretty well connected here. Do you need a job? We can help you get a job. He went out there giving them all hugs. That's living proof that what Jesus says will work. You disarm evil with good. You don't overcome evil by retaliation. But the whole model of God that we have and God with humanity is based on retaliation. God is retaliating against the human race by pouring out his wrath on his son. And we have to thank the son, don't we then? Because he took the wrath that God wanted to pour out on us. This is not the Catholic metaphor as much as the Calvinist metaphor, but the Catholic metaphor is very much like it. God sacrificed his son in order to make atonement for our sins. So we were over that last week a little bit. And that is the foundational metaphor of Western Christianity. And it stems from a medieval notion of justice as restoring the honor of a noble who is offended by demanding the life of the one who offends him if he's a lesser person like a serf and a slave. And that's what we are vis-a-vis God. So God has every right to demand our life in return for our disobedience of his honor in the Garden of Paradise. So goes the narrative, which is all BS. The whole thing is a misreading of Genesis, but that's how it has been handed down to us through the tradition, primarily that came through St. Augustine. But my purpose in these gatherings is to show you there are other streams and other currents of this tradition that are not like that. And that tradition was in the early church, the minority opinion. There was a different opinion in the early church of God as and there is a sense in the East of at-one-ment. Okay, we call it atonement. If they call it anything at all, and they don't use this word, but you could use the same word. If you don't want to get rid of the word atonement, you can use the word atonement, but just divide it up into its three constituent parts, at-one-ment. And that's what I really came here to talk about today, and I will. And I want to fold into that this little kerfluffle about infant baptism and invalid baptisms. But I'm painting a whole picture for you here about a moribund, but that is to say, Walking Dead church that we have inhabited. You can see our churches look like mausoleums. They look like antique shops. And people who are trying to preserve a certain version of the liturgy, like the Latin Mass, that's going back to the 14th, 15th century. They want to preserve a Baroque liturgy. That's like trying to drive your car into God's future by looking in the rearview mirror and hoping that beautiful thing you just passed does not disappear from view. And maybe even stopping because you don't want to go any further and you're so in love with something that's behind you. The current does not stop. The current of God's tradition, the current of God's mystery, the final vision of God for the world does not stop moving towards its culmination. God is moving towards, boy, I really hesitate. I'm not going to go there. Oh, we're not going to go there. Anyway, Christians anticipate an explosion of divine love that makes everything that we have gone through being carried along in the river look negligible by contrast. And yet at the same time, it will make perfect sense of how it couldn't have been any other way. Wow, that's good. Okay, so I want to unpack that a little bit as we move forward here. There was another train of thought there, though. What was I? Oh, the at-one-ment. Okay, so if you insist on keeping the word, it's okay. Richard Rohr does it. Other people I kind of like do it. I'll say just in parentheses here, I have a great appreciation for how Richard Rohr has helped rescue some Catholics who have been alienated from their faith and yet still want to hold on to God as a Catholic, but are still trying to find their way in these uncertain terms. He's provided a great gift for many of them, and there are others out there like him. I don't come at this in exactly the same way that Richard Rohr does. This is not the time for me to tell you about the sources of my inspiration. Mostly the church fathers, mostly the Eastern fathers, but there are contemporary people as well. But I'm not going to go into that today, maybe on another gathering sometime. But the notion of atonement, if you understand every time you see that word, if you divide it up into 3 syllables, you'll be on the right track. At-one-ment, okay? Because the primordial at-one-ment is the Trinity itself. God is at one with himself. He's a transcendental mystery. He's himself, and he also stands outside himself. And you and I are made in the image and likeness of this transcendental. So let me finish the thought on God. God is God in himself. He also stands outside himself and looks at himself. And the knowledge that is imparted and the joy that is imparted when God looks at himself is the third person of the Trinity, known as the Holy Spirit. Now, you and I are created. Boy, just this 2-minute clip is worth the gathering itself today, okay? You and I are created in the image and likeness of this self-transcendent mystery of love and bliss, who God is. We too can stand outside ourselves. Let me show it to you. Most people do not access this capacity that they have to stand outside themselves. I describe it in several of the books that I've put together, the experience of being present. When you're present to someone, you are transcending yourself. When I'm present to you, I have, as it were, come out of myself to be available to you. I've forgotten about myself, but I can also be present to myself. I can sit here and give you this gathering, and there's another part of me which shows the image of God in me. There's another part of me saying, wow, that was pretty amazing. Or you could have done that better. Do you see? I can look at myself. Each of us can look at ourselves even while we're being ourselves. And the capacity to look back on ourselves as we are being ourselves is the life of God manifesting itself in a kind of finite way in all these little individual creatures. And the passion of Christ is that this Trinitarian capacity for self-transcendence is not being actualized or even awakened in most people. They live as if they're one-dimensional. They live unconsciously. They're not aware that they don't have to do what they're doing. They're not aware that they don't have to think what they're thinking. They have identified themselves either with their bodies or with their thoughts or with their situation. But the fact that I can step out of my situation and look at my situation and say, my marriage is terrible. The moment I say my marriage is terrible, my marriage is no longer terrible because I've put some space between me and my marriage. And if I could live in that space of saying, hey, my marriage is miserable, and you can say to your husband, don't you think our marriage is miserable too? And he says, yeah, I kind of think our marriage is miserable. In that mutual standing outside ourselves, we have a good marriage. We're talking to each other nicely about the problem. But the salvation for us, which is our self-transcendence, is so close to us that we don't even notice it. And Christ came into the world to help us notice it. Not only to help us notice it, but to help us live from it. And he also came to show us that that capacity we have to stand outside of ourselves is one with him, because he is the standing outside of itself of God. He is the one, he is the word, he is Jesus is the mirror of God. When God looks at Jesus, he sees himself. And when Jesus looks back at the Father, he sees himself, but there are two persons transcending themselves in the other. I hope that's not too confusing to you, but I think you get the point. So it's our capacity for letting go. See, suffering always comes. It's amazing how the Holy Spirit works in these gatherings, I'm telling you. No intention of talking about this, because I do want to talk about the final completion of God's desire for the cosmos and where the river is going and where the current is aiming. But in the meantime, we have this mystery of presence. And when we transcend ourselves, we can suddenly see, I am not the thoughts in my head. I am not my body. That's, if you watch the near-death experiences, that's the biggest revelation that people have when their soul separates from their body. The soul separating from the body is the actualization of our potential to be self-transcendent. Death is the sudden awareness that for my whole life, I have not been identical with my body. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we knew that while we were in our bodies? It's not that our bodies are bad. They are good. They are given to us as a means of expressing who we are. But if we identify ourselves with our body, then when our bodies are dying, we believe we're going out of existence. And that's the big lie of the deceiver. Because when he can convince you that you're one with your body, and when your body goes, you go, then the door is open for every sort of self-preservation and self-assertion and self-protection that ends up wreaking havoc on everybody else in the world. So all suffering comes from trying to cling to life. And trying to cling to life comes from identifying myself either with my thoughts or with my body or with my situation. I can't lose my home. I can't lose my family. I can't lose this. If I lose that, there's nothing. That's not true. But if you live with that kind of identification with what you can see, rather than your capacity to see it, you will end up walking, you'll be like a blind man in a china shop. You'll be knocking over people, you'll be hurting people, you'll be hurting yourself. And all the while you'll think the problem's in them. And you'll blame them, and the problem will get worse. So it's from that morass that Christ comes in to establish us in freedom. Freedom from identification with, primarily with our thinking about other people. Another person is never what I think about them. Never. I don't know them. They don't know themselves. The only person who knows any of us is really God. But if we know that who I am is not exhausted by anything I do, if they said, Father Phil, you can't be a priest tomorrow, I'm still me. The priesthood is just a vehicle for God, for me to express the person and give to the world the gifts that God has given me. And I have to have the capacity, when I say I here, I mean each one of us, I have to have the capacity to be able to stand outside myself and say, these are my gifts. That's not pride. That's actual humility. When I stand outside myself and make an honest appraisal of first of my behavior and then of the character defects and gifts that account for my behavior, which go deeper than my behavior. You see, I am not identical with my behavior. I am not even identical with the gifts that or the liabilities, the weaknesses, the lack of gifts that contribute to those behaviors, good and bad. I am a mystery even more fundamental than that. How do I know that? Is because I can make these observations about myself. I couldn't say of myself, I have strengths and weaknesses, unless the real me was somehow already beyond all those things. And that's the real me that God knows. The real me is beyond both my strengths and my weaknesses. It's a pristine, that is to say, perfectly pure and unalloyed and untouchable and unbreakable and indivisible, unique mystery that is created from a similarly unique mystery and does not enjoy the same being that the originating mystery has, but I am a God with a small g that has been created by the God with the big G, who is not a thing at all. He is the mystery of self-transcendence from which all creatures who can transcend themselves emerge. And here's a little news flash for you also. We are not the only creatures who can self-transcend. Dogs can actually self-transcend. There is an element of consciousness and knowingness. You see, when I know something, it means that I have a space between myself and that which is known. I am not absorbed in the object of my attention. When we look at people who live their lives like marionettes on a puppet string, where something happens and they react, these people, you can always tell these kind of people, they're very crisis oriented. They're always living in drama. They swim in drama because they have no, what John Paul II called, they have no self-possession. They are identified with their moods at the moment. So they live a reactive rather than a responsive life. They don't know how to respond because they haven't learned the capacity to think or to be aware of what's happening. People who are greatest in times of crisis, like that woman in the dinner party that I just mentioned to you, stuff happens, but they don't respond immediately. They put a space in between what's happening and their assessment of it. And they're assessing it from a standpoint removed from it. If they are immersed in it, then they go into a panic. Their mind literally blanks out. They go blank, fight or flight. People who are identified with the situation in the immediate context of empirical reality, when something happens, they just react. There's no space, there's no distance, there's no pause. God is always in the pause. Like when you throw a ball in the air, reaches the apex, and there's an indefinable moment at the top where it stops and it drops from there. On a teeter-totter, there's an indefinable point on the fulcrum where there is no tension. It's in that God's presence is in those little indefinable points. And there is a similarly indefinable point at the center of your being, which is accessible through contemplative prayer, that allows the world to be the world, allows your body to be your body, allows your thoughts to be your thoughts, allows other people to be other people, and establishes you in God in such a spirit of letting go-ness that you couldn't care if you died in the next second, because you've already entered the kingdom of God. That's what the mystics are talking about. That's what Thomas Merton is talking about. And that's what Jesus Christ is talking about. When he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, he's saying to you, you could never do that if you don't know how to enter the still point of complete self-transcendence and letting go. You have to let go of yourself to discover yourself. You have to die in order to live. You have to die, that is to say, to your thoughts and identification with the things of this world or your situation. You must let it go completely and you will rise to new life. You will come in contact with that point of letting go-ness and presence and just being rather than doing. You will arrive at that mysterious point of, I am what I am. Remember, that was the name for God. Who should I say is telling me? I am who I am. And when I let go completely and let go of my identification of myself as a priest or a Catholic or an American or a white man, or let go of all the identitarian labels that the deceiver implodes on the world to create chaos and murder and deception inside and outside the church. When I let go of all those labels, I am not a priest. I am not an American. I am not a man. I am who I am. In that space, there is a kind of letting go of all control, all control. There's a letting go also of all judgment. There's a letting go of all anxiety. And yet, in that place, I can see myself, I can see my behavior, I can see other people in all their fallibilities, all their mistakes, all their struggles, and I can have mercy. Only from the place of self-transcendence can I have the kind of mercy that Jesus asks us to have. And that's why this is what I want to talk about today. That's why his life in this world was a perpetual crucifixion, because he always lived from a standpoint outside of himself. He never identified himself, even though he was the Messiah. He did not identify himself with the Messiah. He identified himself with the other, who was the Father. He lived from a standpoint outside of himself, and that standpoint was what he described as the life of my Father. And he came into the world knowing that each of these creatures that he was looking at was created by his Father, because he's also their Father. He prayed that in his last prayer. I'm going to my Father and to your Father. He really came to awaken us to the fact that we are as much from God as he is from God, and we will experience our from Godness when we access our ability to stand outside of ourselves and outside of our situation, to let it be. Let my husband be. Let my children be. Let the Ukrainians be. And I hasten to say right here too, okay, because this is important. When I can establish myself, or when I allow God to establish me in that point of letting go-ness, self-transcendence, standing outside what's happening at the moment, the guy with the gun in my face, stand outside of it. Okay, why don't you shoot me? When you talk like that, you're coming from a place they're not in. They're lost in another place. When transcendence enters a situation, it can disarm the most malevolent evil. It just takes the wind right out of its sails. That's what St. Polycarp did today. That's why I mentioned the dinner party. When they came to arrest St. Polycarp and burn him at the stake, he said, let's have dinner together first. And all the Roman soldiers sat down, and he said, now let me explain something to you. He says, I'm 82 years old. I've believed in this Lord ever since I heard of him from John the apostle, his apostle. What worth would if you went to your Roman graves, not believing in your Roman gods, and I went to my grave, not professing faith in my Christian God, what kind of soldier would I be? And they saluted him. They said, we honor you. We still have to kill you. He says, I understand. You see, when you have those kinds of conversations, you're speaking from a different place. Yes, I'm going to die. Thomas More did the same thing. St. Agnes did the same thing. She was an 11-year-old martyr, kind of a patristic St. Maria Goretti, the Roman soldier wanted to marry her and if not, rape her. And she said, do what you need to do. And he said, I can't do it. He says, but I do have to kill you. And she says, I understand. Don't worry. But she was a beautiful young girl, and he had a daughter himself, apparently. So his hand was shaking so much, she grabbed his hand and said, "Here, let me help you. You send me to my Redeemer." It's an 11-year-old girl. Now, we say that kind of grace is supernatural, but it is the essence of every human person, unrealized by virtually every human person. The saints are those who live outside of themselves, but also at the same time in themselves. See, because when I live outside of identification with what's going on at the immediate moment, I'm living in the spirit. I have breathing room. I'm able to observe things much more clearly and much more calmly than I'm able to when things are going by me in a crisis mode and I can't even get my head spinning around like a top. And that's how most people live their lives. They live lives of quiet desperation. As Shakespeare said, people live lives of sound and fury, signifying nothing, or this priest worrying about the infant baptisms. That's a person who has not exercised a capacity for self-transcendence. Okay, I don't want to lose this thing about, so it's from that place. Now, Jesus not only comes from that place, but he is the incarnation of that space of not being identified even with his human condition. The Father is greater than I, and I am one with the Father. You can kill my body, but in 3 days I will rise because I am who I am. And his message was, you are who you are. Learn to live as the one who you are, which is not the one you think you are. It's not the one you identify with. It's the one who can stand outside herself and look at all those things. And in that space of being able to look at any situation from outside the situation, because it's a place of such peace and serenity and perfect bliss in God, and because it is living in God, truly, you are granted in that space of letting go-ness, when you are not worried about your children anymore, or you say, okay, if they're going to die, they're going to die. If you can get to that place of letting go-ness, you will almost immediately, sometimes it takes a little while, it takes a long time to know how to even touch, get close to that space. Most people are so lost in the details and the identifications of their lives and their finances, their kids, their clothes, their jobs, their spouses, their religion. They can't see clear. They're blind. They're literally blind. All the miracles of blindness in the gospel are awakening people to their self-transcendence. Every miracle of Jesus is bringing a person from the suffering everyone endures when you've identified with being something or other, this or that, and taking you away from that identification and showing you you are beloved just as you are, not as you think you need to be. So that's what Jesus did. Jesus is the deliverer from being lost in sin. Sin is being blind and unconscious, doing hurt to each other because we've been deceived by the deceiver about who we are. That's basically the whole substance of salvation history right there in one sentence. Okay, so we are deceived by the deceiver who prompts us to identify through our parents, through all generations, it's the meaning of original sin, identify with what society tells you you're supposed to be, and you will be happy. The truth is, do that and you will die. And you will be terrified of death, and in your terror of death, you will commit unspeakable evil. All the while, you'll think you're doing God's will. And that's the state of the Catholic Church. That's the state of the world. So Catholics are no different. Okay. So Christ comes to save us from that, to pull us out of that, because he is that. He's the one that always stands above. But in standing above, he receives from the Father the wisdom to help those who are still living below. So when you let go, I'll give you an example, okay? When you let go of your children completely and say to God, if they die, they die. If you can get to that place, and it takes a lot of gatherings and a lot of practice in ways that we don't have chance to go into here in the gathering. It can be my husband, it can be my kids, it can be my finances, it can be anything. St. John of the Cross said, if you are clinging to anything, even if it's a crucifix or a prayer book, if you are clinging to things as if you're going to find the meaning of life in them, you are just as tied down to the world of the devil as you would be if you were like Gulliver, pinned down by 1,000 such attachments. You have to stand outside of everything, including your own body, and look back at it. Now, in the space of looking back at myself and my kids and others, the way you can tell whether or not you're doing this is, because let me finish the first thought. When you step outside of yourself and live in the place of self-transcendence, you get more wisdom about what you should be doing than you ever got when you couldn't figure it out. If you can get free from the chaos, you can see the chaos for what it is, and you will also receive from the Holy Spirit whatever wisdom you need to make whatever difference you can, which is usually very negligible, in the lives of those that you have momentarily self-transcended. So wisdom about child rearing or politics or religion only comes when I can detach from it. But most people can't detach. Now, how can you tell? In the space of detachment, or that sounds so cold, the way I think of it is in the place of surrender, in the place of letting go, in the place of standing outside myself, in the space of relating to myself, in the space of knowing that I am not what I think, I am not what I say, I am not what I do. I'm a human being, not a human doing. When I can live from that space, I have perfect peace. You can even feel it in your body. When you get in that place in prayer, everything, it's as if your body becomes, I just saw a video of a collapsible lady. Did you ever see that? I sent that video to some of you. Anyway, you know, those people whose limbs are really loose and they can almost be folded up. There was a lady, I showed a video, she came out in a box and she was folded, it looked like a rag doll. And the guy treated her like a rag doll through the performance. And at the end, she stands up as a real person. And he fitted her into the size of a television box. It's really incredible. Apparently every one of her joints. But when you get to the point of letting go, your body will feel like that. It'll have a big release. I see this happen in people who are dying. When they finally get to that point of detaching from this world, when they finally let go of their death grip on life, and that's what it is, their death grip on life, to the extent, that's the whole teaching of Jesus, to the extent that you hold on, you're killing yourself. If you let go, you will rise. Like my father told me when he was trying to teach me to swim, you're too tight. He says, you're too rigid, you're too scared. You're going to go down to the bottom like a rock if I leave you go. He said, loosen up, lighten up. I couldn't do it. I was paralyzed by fear, so I became rigid. The whole church for centuries now has been rigid with fear of God. We had all these rituals and theories of atonement to plead to God to save us from God. When you look at it objectively, when you take a big step back from the whole tradition and look at what has happened in our Catholic Church, it's a whole shell game of trying to bargain with God against God. What's the alternative? Well, it's going to be found in that place of self-transcendence, okay? Now, there was something else I was going to tell you there. Okay, God, I'll just leave it there. Anybody? Yeah, Earl's got a question, so thank you. I'll take
you could comment on what St. Polycarp contributed to your thinking.
Correct. So I had started to say that Thomas More and many of the martyrs were like Polycarp because they lived from the place of surrender to God. Now, that doesn't mean they don't value their children and appreciate their spouse. They do. In fact, in that space of self-transcendence, you have a much greater and a much purer love for your spouse and for people in your lives than you do when you're immersed in them. You know, John Paul used to say, what lust is for men, which is the contamination of love, what lust is for men, possessiveness or control is for women. My husband. Nobody talks to my husband. You know what I mean? He's mine. Anyway, so but it doesn't matter what form it takes. It's all the same thing. It's a wanting to have for myself so that I don't die. And that means that I lack the capacity for I don't lack the capacity for it. I've never known I have the capacity for it. Most people go to their graves, but, and yeah, I started to say this, I'll come back to Thomas More as well. In a certain sense, well, another topic, now I'm getting into universalism. I'm not going to go there today, but I've been with many people when they die, and almost every person I've been with, when their body is breaking down, and I think they dimly realize, even in a coma, they dimly realize that my body is leaving, but I'm not leaving. I'm still me. My body is dying. And it's like when that first awareness, I believe most people come to a sense of their own capacity for self-transcendence at the end of their life, when they could have lived their whole life in it and had much more felicitous relationships and had a much more blissful and joyous relationship with God, realizing that their very capacity for self-transcendence was their union with God throughout their whole life, which allows them to practice their religion in a much less totally fearless way and a much more blissful way. And in fact, religion is aimed at helping people get beyond themselves, get over yourself. We have that, that's an appeal to self-transcendence. Get over yourself. Get out, snap out of it. That's an appeal to your higher self. So there's myself and my higher self, and my higher self is my real self. And when my higher self and my lower self become one, I will be living as the person God created me to be. And the spiritual life and religion is meant to create that at-one-ment, to unite my lower self, my sinful self, the earthly man that Paul talked about last week, and to unite that with the spiritual man. Who's the spiritual man? It's every person's capacity for self-transcendence. That's the spiritual man. Jesus was the incarnation of that capacity for self-transcendence. He is the living self-transcendence of God. Boy, this is good. Now, see there, I'm standing outside myself. When I interrupt myself and say, wow, that was good, I'm standing outside myself, noticing something that is given to the gathering that didn't come from me. And that happens often. When you live from outside yourself, all kinds of things happen to you. All kinds of things come into your life that you think are coincidences, but they are, once I enter the space of God within my own life, which is my ability to stand outside myself, all kinds of good things start to happen. With my kids, when I let go of my kids, everything happens that I was trying to compel before that. When you let go, it comes. When you hold on, it never comes. But how to get to that indefinable point between holding on and letting go. Now, death is God's gift to break us from holding on. The early church looked at death kind of like the mercy rule in kids softball. They're making such a wreck of their life that I better bring this thing to an end and show them who they really are by awakening them to their true self, which is what we typically call the soul. And you can see it at people's deathbed. You can see it. Sometimes their last breath is their letting go. And it's like all the anxiety of the years dissolves. I've seen some people's faces almost change when they die. And it's a nice phrase we use. They're now at rest. Well, that's true. They're not dead. Most people think they're at rest, meaning they're in a better place. Well, that's true. They don't know how true that is. They think they think they're in a place of oblivion. They can't feel it anymore. They can't know. That's not true. They are knowing for the first time, and their hell in purgatory is the sudden awareness that God created me to be like I am now the whole time I was out there. And they'll see all the ways in which not living from their true self damage them and others, and it will be a living hell. But it'll also be a remedial hell. The vision of how I screwed it up because I didn't know the time of my visitation, because I did not know my own self capacity for standing outside myself and the problems that beset me, and thereby being a better instrument in helping to do what I can to solve those problems. My awareness that I've not done any of that, even though I heard about it on those Wednesday gatherings. No, not just kidding. There will be a painful life review of my life as an unconscious person who, without knowing it, betrayed the image of God in himself or in herself. And the reason I say it's remedial, not condemnatory, even though it's painful, is because they literally did not know any better. They never had a Wednesday gathering. They never had a parent or a mentor or a teacher who could teach them to get over themselves. They never had that. They were under the influence, they were a slave their whole life to the deceiver, who convinced them, often using very cunning arguments about becoming rich and successful and powerful and strong and keeping the stiff upper lip, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the cliches of garbage that we have in our culture. The deceiver is a master at blinding people by these false identifications with stuff that is literally nothing. It's dust. Gold is dust. Houses are dust. Bodies are dust. Unto dust you shall return. The pearl of great price is my capacity for self-transcendence. And Christ came to be not only to incarnate that for us, but to show us what a life lived like that would look like, and to impart to us the strength to live that life. And when he says to Saul, 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 why are you persecuting me? He's saying, every person you see, remember, now I'm paraphrasing kind of in a quasi-prophetic way here, but it's as if Jesus is saying to Paul, when I was the son of Mary, I was the living incarnation of what all those other people are in themselves. Now that I am a life-giving spirit, I am revealing to you that they, in their capacity for self-transcendence, and I, as the self-transcendent dimension of God, are one. Their capacity for transcendence is my life within them, and my life within them is the life of God within them. So they are one with me, and they are one with my Father, because even though we are one, we are also distinct. I stand outside the Father, yet I am one with the Father. The Father is greater than I, but I am one with the Father. I am the Father being present to himself. And that those words you hear are those of the Holy Spirit, Jesus would be saying. Okay, so that's probably more mysticism than you asked for today. Let me see what time it is. Okay, we got a few minutes left. Let me talk about this ridiculous issue of infant baptism. So now your normal parish priest is not going to tell you what I just told you there for an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, but it's only that understanding of human personhood, of its relationship to the incarnate logos and the self-transcendence of God in the pre-eternal at-one-ment of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's only that context of divine at-oneness, but a self-transcendent oneness. It's only in that context that anything that we do in the church, or anything we do sacramentally, or anything we do morally, it's only in that context that any of these actions have any meaning. Apart from that narrative, these things are just sacraments, good works, rules of the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're like BBs in a bread box rolling around with no internal coherence. Okay, you have to have the overall vision of at-one-ment to understand what the purpose of things like sacraments and the church and the Pope and baptism, what they mean. Okay, and I haven't put the loop on the entire narrative. Now I've talked about the pre-eternal Trinity as a mystery of divine self-transcendence of love, and us being made in that image and likeness, and Christ coming into the world to awaken people to their own capacity to be like God within themselves, and to give us the power to do that, and to identify himself with us in his risen state as well. All those things I just gave to you. Okay, but there's a further end of this, because all of that Christ did and is doing is all aimed at a final revelation, unveiling, apocalypse. It's aimed at a final unveiling of a mystery of self-transcendence that includes God, us, and every other creature that he ever made. I said earlier, and I never finished this thought, that in this apocalyptic, that is to say, anagogical, that's a word in the catechism that most people gloss over, and it means in the final version of what God has desired ever since he started making anything, and why he has allowed all the unconscious evil to continue for generations, how he's going to reconcile all things in himself is a mystery yet to be unveiled to us. But Christianity is a religion of infinite hope, knowing that through the experience of self-transcendence, this final revelation or unveiling of God's self-transcendence that includes us and every other creature in it, including the fallen angels, can't but be more glorious and more blissful than anything we can imagine. It'll be an eternal standing outside of ourselves that is always just a beginning. Okay, now that's the end state of things, okay? And you need that whole narrative of salvation from creation to apocalypse to understand something like invalid baptisms, okay? You can see how trivial they sound by comparison, okay? And this probably requires a whole session on baptism, because I know all of us have been taught that baptism is an entry into the life of God, and all that's true. Okay, and I don't have time to go into this in great detail. I'm going to give you the Cliff Note versions, okay, of the kerfuffle and of baptism in general. So let's just talk about, first of all, I finished my thought. I said in this final vision, all beings are restored to this, in this unveiling of God's final self-transcendence that includes us and all of the cosmos. Every creature and every stone and every rock and every ounce of water will also participate. And one thought that I did not finish earlier, maybe I did, even at the subatomic level of creation, plants and animals, going all the way down from humanoids down to nematodes, and beyond that, down to the subatomic level, to the quantum level. You will find that even atoms and electrons and photons have a certain kind of self-awareness. They have a certain kind of consciousness. They have a certain kind of self-transcendence. Stones can talk at a certain level. Okay, we certainly know this of animals. They can react to us. You can tell that they are conscious in a way that we cannot understand, but they have a kind of consciousness that's different from ours, probably not as self-transcendent, but in some measure transcendent, to be able to know it all and to be able to calculate in whatever manner that happens in the mystery of God and the dog, what's appropriate and what's not. And they never make a mistake, because they are not deceived by the deceiver. Dogs are more blessed than us in a way, because they can't think like we think. Only our kind of thinking can cause suffering. Theirs can't. Their thinking is, remember I talked in some of the gatherings about true freedom having no deliberative will, not needing to deliberate, having no nomic will, not needing to deliberate, not needing to choose among options, knowing instinctively what to do without thinking about it, like Jesus did. That's being fully human. Well, that's a dog for you. Get a dog. If you want to know how to be a good person, get a dog. If you want to know how to love, get a dog. They're a lot better than a spouse, I can tell you that. Well, not better, but when you've given up on your spouse, go to your dog. You can kick a dog and they'll still love you. So, okay, so all of creation is also a mystery of self-transcendence, but in many different forms, many different genres, many different natures, many different essences, okay, many different kinds. Okay, all that being said, let's come back to this thing about, so in this final vision, so we've heard that baptism and the right words being used see, once you start getting down, and in sacramental theology, there's such a thing called matter and form. These are scholastic distinctions that came from the Middle Ages that most people have no concept what the philosophical history of these distinctions is. Most priests don't have a clue, but they know there's matter and form. Okay, so the matter is the bread and the wine. The form is always the words that make the bread and the wine the body and blood of Christ. Okay, that's a very mechanistic way. It's a very mechanical way. It's a very magical way, quite frankly. A very magical way of describing what happens in the Mass. Okay, but that's the way we've inherited. That's why the Eastern Church calls the Eucharist a mystery, not a mechanical act of transubstantiation. They would never use that in a million years. That would be like talking about marital intercourse as a chemical reaction or a biological function. They feel like it demeans the honor of what's going on at the Mass. To call it transubstantiation, the transformation of one substance into another, they would say to themselves, what the hell does that even mean? And in the Middle Ages, because we inherited this mechanical view of what's going on in the Eucharist, there were debates that went on. They're still going on in the church, and the infant baptism question is a debate very much like this. And you can see how ridiculous it is in light of the narrative that I've just spelled out for you. And that is this. There were debates in the Middle Ages. Well, if the words hoc est corpus meum, and this gets back to Luther as well. If those words, hoc est corpus meum, are the form that make the matter the body and blood of Christ, if that's the magic moment at which the bread and wine is transformed into the substance of Christ's body and blood, well, exactly at what moment? Was it when he said hoc? Was it when he said est? Corpus? Is it between the O and the U? They were looking for a magic moment. They were like looking for that fulcrum point on the teeter-totter. Where does that magic moment occur? And when the people in the East, the Eastern Christians, are listening to these medieval debates about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, or when does the Eucharist actually become the Eucharist? Is it when the priest genuflects? Is it when he lifts it up? Is it when he takes it in his? I mean, honestly, there were schools of theology that divided and orders that were antagonistic to each other. People who didn't go into the religious life because one community believed it happened now and another community believed it happened then, and they fought about it for years. Can you imagine anything so? But if that's how you look at the Eucharist, it does make a certain kind of sense. But it's all because the Eucharist had been dumbed down to a mechanical model of chemistry. Okay, so you need a different model to imagine what's going on. Do we believe it becomes the body and blood of Christ? Yes. Do we look for a magic moment? No, that's when mystery becomes magic. Hocus pocus. In fact, that's what the Protestants used to accuse the Catholics of. They go over to their church, they engage in hocus pocus, because that's what they heard the priest doing. Hoc est corpus. You still have younger priests. They want to bring it back. The younger priests want to bring it back. They wear the fiddleback chasubles because they think that's more holy. Then they bend way over the chalice and they want to make sure that they get the words exactly right. They got both their fingers on the host like this, as if the host won't become Christ if they don't. Hoc est corpus meum. I don't mean to demean this at all. What I mean to tell you is that way of celebrating the Eucharist is demeaning the mystery. It really is sad to me. I understand, though, why people do it, because failing reverence in any other dimension of their religion. They look for something that they can make sacrosanct, and they think by dressing up in gowns and looking like liturgical Liberaces, they can do it, but it's not the case, okay? The early Christians had none of that stuff. They gathered, they felt that Christ was communing with them, and they were being drawn into communion, and somehow this bread and wine that they had present was the mechanism by which he was forming an at-one-ment with all of humanity through them, with the unveiling that is yet to come. Wow, that's good. Okay, so now the infant baptism. Okay, so baptism is similar. Two things about baptism. What time? 5? I got 5 minutes. Do you believe I can actually do all of baptism in 5 minutes? Okay, here, you're going to want to watch this recording again because I'm going to stop it in 5 minutes. And this is everything you need to know about baptism. First, with respect to the invalid baptisms, I said at the beginning of the gathering today, both in the East and in the West, and miraculously in the West, because it survived all the scholastic rigidification of the faith that I've caricatured and kind of poo-hooed today in the gathering, and I poo-hoo at every gathering because it needs to be thrown out like bad bathwater, okay? But even amidst all of that, there's been a great principle in the church that has survived throughout the ages that the Bishop of Phoenix could have used to avert the whole problem, and everybody except the anal retentive, obsessive, compulsive Latin massers would go for, and that is this. There's a principle in the East, they call it the economia, the economy of God. And in the West, they call it ecclesia supplet. It's a principle of canon law. Ecclesia supplet. Anybody know Latin? I don't, but I know what those two words mean. It means ecclesia, the church, supplies. The church supplies the grace that the minister overlooked. It's being grandfathered in. Okay, so I'll give you an example of where ecclesia supplet has been most used in the history of the church. I have to use it on a Saturday myself, once in a while. Person comes into confession, you can tell from the moment they open their mouth, they're obsessive compulsive. So I listen as patiently and as kindly as I can. Actually, I listen with quite a bit of mercy, because there was a time when, I mean, I never flirted with, it's hard to be a Catholic boy growing up in a Catholic grade school without having a little bit of obsessive guilt about you. So I can empathize is what I'm saying. Thank God I never fell prey to it. And listen, obsessive compulsive disorder and scrupulosity is one of the greatest afflictions a person can bear. Many of the saints, Alphonsus Liguori, Teresa of Lisieux, and others have suffered grievously from scrupulosity, and thank God we're delivered of it. But the whole church for the Middle Ages was largely scrupulous, and we've inherited all that. But the antidote to that was this phrase, ecclesia supplet. It means the church supplies what you were lacking. The church takes care of what you messed up on. Okay, so Luther probably would have stayed in the church if he had gone to his confessor and said, I'm obsessed about making mistakes at Mass. And the confessor had simply said, ecclesia supplet. God takes care of it. No, he knows your heart intended to do the right thing. He's giving you the benefit of the doubt. Ecclesia supplet is giving you the benefit of the doubt. Now, a scrupulous person will turn around and say, I don't deserve it. I don't want the benefit of the doubt. I want certainty. And there's nothing you can tell a person in that situation. And that's why you see a lot of these people in these kind of sectarian sedevacanist movements within the Catholic Church, meaning it's not the real Catholic Church, Pope Francis is not the real Pope, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of people out there like that. They're crazy. They literally are mentally obsessed, and they have fragments of theological truth, but they don't have a narrative that allows you to make any sense of them. Okay, so all the bishop in Phoenix would have had to say is, I've talked to the priest. I can assure the diocese that he never intended to invalidly baptize. He's a priest in good standing with the archdiocese. He can't even remember how he started doing that. I believe him. Ecclesia supplet. All you who think you were invalidly baptized, understand that God understands. You desired to do the right thing. Your intention was good. He wouldn't have baptized you were your intention not good. His intentions were good. And even though I know the road to hell can be paved sometimes with good intentions, in this case, ecclesia suplet. I have spoken, the issue is over. It's all he would have had to do, and the internet would not have been exploded with catcalls of heresy all over the world,
Why
okay?
did he resign?
Did the bishop resign or the priest?
I thought that priest.
Maybe he did, but that's just more scrupulosity if he did. He has nothing to apologize for. Okay, with baptism itself, so I mean, now I can't go into this because we're already at the top of the hour. So I'll suffice this to say, does everybody, yeah, I'll say this in a minute and a half, I promise, and we'll unpack it next week if you want. Is it true that baptism is necessary to enter the kingdom of heaven? Catholics say yes. I'm a Catholic priest. Let me say yes. It all depends on how you understand that yes, okay? And I'll just start with basic Catholic teaching, and it will be a minute and a half, I promise. Is baptism with water the only form of baptism? No. Baptism with blood, St. Polycarp. Baptism of desire, a catechumen who's preparing for baptism and dies before he can receive it. He desired. Well, what about all those other people who don't have baptism of desire or baptism of blood or baptism of water? Do they also need to be baptized? Yes, they do. Well, then how are they baptized? They are baptized by desire. What do you mean they're baptized by desire? They don't desire baptism. No, but they desire to do good. Every action a person does is a desire to achieve some good. In desiring to achieve some good, they are actually desiring to achieve God himself. Therefore, they desire God. Therefore, they are baptized by desire. Therefore, they are pleasing to God. So that's it in a nutshell, but it would take an hour and a half to unpack that. So we'll leave it at that. Everyone is baptized by their desire for the good, because there's nobody, including the evil angels, who do what they do without desiring the good, no matter how much misshapen or deceived it may be. And that's the ultimate basis for the divine unveiling of total reconstitution of all things in Christ. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you. You know what?